Welcome to Grow Yourself Great. Before you can change the pattern, you have to understand the psychology that built it. Few psychological disorders have been misunderstood, oversimplified, and casually misused as much as bipolar disorder. Someone is energetic one day and tired the next. They're bipolar. Someone becomes emotional during an argument. They're bipolar. Someone is pleasant in the morning and irritated by the afternoon. They're bipolar. Over time, the word has become detached from its actual psychological meaning. But bipolar disorder is not ordinary inconsistency. It is not simply being emotional. It is not having good days and bad days. It is not changing your opinion. And it is not a personality description for someone whose reactions are difficult for other people to predict. Bipolar disorder is one of the most biologically, psychologically, emotionally, and behaviorally complex conditions recognized in mental health. It has the capacity to alter how a person experiences themselves, how they experience other people, how they experience time, possibility, risk, relationships, their future, and in some instances, their relationships with reality itself. That last statement deserves your attention because one of the greatest misunderstandings about bipolar disorder is believing that it is simply about mood. It is not. Mood is only one part of the picture. Imagine taking every system responsible for helping you navigate life, your emotions, your motivation, your confidence, your sleep, your energy, your judgment, your attention, your memory, your decision-making, your perception of danger, your ability to evaluate consequences, and in severe cases, your ability to determine what is and is not real. Now imagine many of those systems changing together. That is much closer to what clinicians are evaluating when assessing bipolar disorder. This is why bipolar disorder cannot be understood by asking one question. Are they happy or sad? The more important questions become, has their energy changed? Has their need for sleep changed? Has their thinking changed? Has their confidence changed? Has their judgment changed? Has their behavior changed? Has their functioning changed? And has their ability to recognize these changes changed? Because sometimes one of the features accompanying a manic episode is losing awareness that anything has changed at all. That can be difficult for people who have never experienced it to understand. Imagine everyone around you insisting something is wrong, while your own mind is telling you, this is the clearest I have ever thought. Imagine someone saying, you need help, while every internal experience tells you, no, I have finally figured life out. Imagine your family seeing danger while you see destiny. Imagine your spouse seeing a symptom while you experience purpose. Imagine a clinician describing impairment while you believe you have finally become the version of yourself everyone previously underestimated. Can you see the dilemma? This masterclass is not intended to diagnose you or someone you know. Diagnosis requires a comprehensive clinical evaluation that considers medical history, psychiatric history, medications, substance use, duration of symptoms, change from baseline, functional impairment, differential diagnosis, family history, and many other variables. Instead, my goal is something different. If you live with bipolar disorder, I want you to feel understood, not pitied, not reduced to a diagnosis, not treated like a stereotype. Understood. I want you to hear descriptions of experiences you may have struggled to explain. I want you to recognize the difference between what other people saw and what the experience may have meant from inside your mind. If you love someone living with bipolar disorder, I want you to understand what cannot be seen simply by observing behavior. Because behavior is the visible part of psychology. Meaning is usually hidden underneath it. And if you know very little about bipolar disorder, I want this to fundamentally change how you understand it. Not because understanding removes responsibility. It does not. Not because understanding excuses harm. It does not. Understanding simply allows us to respond to reality more accurately. And accurate understanding is where meaningful change begins. So let's begin with one of the most important words in this entire conversation, episode. When most people hear the word bipolar, they imagine someone whose emotions rapidly swing back and forth throughout the day. Happy, angry, sad, excited, calm, then emotional again. That image is understandable. It just is not what bipolar disorder usually means clinically. One of the defining characteristics of bipolar disorder is that it is organized around mood episodes. An episode is a sustained departure from a person's usual way of functioning. That word, departure, is important. Because clinicians are never simply asking, what is this person doing? They are asking, is this person functioning in a way that is noticeably different from who they ordinarily are? Notice the difference. Not, do they have energy? Everyone has energy sometimes. Not, did they stay up late? Most adults occasionally stay up late. Not, did they spend too much money? Many people make poor financial decisions. Not, were they unusually excited? Excitement is part of being human. Diagnosis does not live inside one behavior. Diagnosis lives inside the pattern. Patterns unfolding across time. Patterns affecting multiple areas of life. Patterns involving mood, energy, sleep, thinking, judgment, behavior, and functioning. Imagine someone you have known for 10 years, reliable, thoughtful, financially cautious, reserved, needs 8 hours of sleep. Then within a week, they are sleeping 2 hours a night, talking almost nonstop, calling family members at 3 a.m. because they have discovered an incredible business opportunity, opening multiple credit cards, planning 3 companies, buying expensive equipment, telling everyone they are about to become internationally successful, quitting their job because they no longer believe they need it. That is not simply enthusiasm. That represents a significant departure from baseline. Now imagine the opposite. That same person who was engaged with life suddenly cannot get out of bed. Food no longer feels rewarding. Music no longer reaches them emotionally. They stop answering messages. Simple decisions become exhausting. Their body feels heavy. Their mind begins using every mistake as evidence against them. Hope begins disappearing. Not for an afternoon, for weeks. Again, the clinician is not simply observing sadness. They are observing an episode, a state, a different organization of the mind. Understanding episodes also helps us distinguish bipolar disorder from ordinary emotional responses. If someone loses a loved one, deep sadness is understandable. If someone gets promoted, excitement makes sense. If someone is betrayed, anger is expected. Life moves us emotionally. Psychology expects that. But bipolar episodes become larger than the events that may have preceded them. Sometimes stress contributes. Sleep disruption contributes. Sometimes childbirth contributes. Sometimes substances contribute. Sometimes a medication contributes. Sometimes there appears to be no obvious trigger at all, regardless of how the episode begins. Once it develops, the person's broader psychological organization begins changing. The episode starts influencing how the person interprets experience itself. That distinction is one of the most important ideas you will hear today. Because bipolar disorder is not simply about having emotions. It is about emotions becoming part of a broader change in how the mind organizes experience. And episodes do not always end with the person immediately returning to perfect functioning. Some people do return close to their usual baseline between episodes. Others experience residual difficulties. Sleep may remain vulnerable. Concentration may still feel impaired. Confidence may take time to return. Anxiety about another episode may remain. Relationships may still be damaged. Financial consequences may still need to be managed. The episode may be over, while its effects continue occupying the person's life. That matters, because bipolar disorder is not only the experience of the episode, it is sometimes the work of rebuilding after it. That naturally brings us to another misunderstanding. Many people believe there is only one kind of bipolar disorder. There is not. One of the biggest mistakes people make is talking about bipolar disorder as though everyone experiences the exact same condition. The reality is much more nuanced. The DSM-5-TR recognizes several bipolar and related disorders. They are connected, but they are not identical. Understanding these distinctions matters because different forms of bipolar disorder can look very different in everyday life. And misunderstanding those differences can delay recognition, delay treatment, and sometimes change the entire direction of someone's life. Let's begin with bipolar 1 disorder. When many people imagine bipolar disorder, they are usually imagining bipolar 1. Not necessarily because it is the form they understand best, but because it often contains the symptoms most recognizable to the public. The defining feature of bipolar 1 disorder is the occurrence of at least one manic episode. Everything else begins there. That surprises many people because they assume bipolar disorder means both depression and mania must always occur. Clinically, that is not true. A person may experience profound depression. Many people with bipolar 1 do, but a major depressive episode is not required for the diagnosis. One manic episode, assuming it is not better explained by substances, medications, or another medical condition, is sufficient to establish bipolar 1 disorder. That should immediately communicate something important. Mania is not simply a stronger version of happiness. If one manic episode alone can establish an entire psychiatric diagnosis, then mania must involve far more than elevated mood, and it does. Before we understand mania, we need to understand something else. People often imagine psychiatric disorders as things people have, as though they are carrying an object. But bipolar disorder can feel more like entering different psychological climates. Imagine living in the same house. The furniture has not changed. The address has not changed. The neighborhood has not changed, but every few months, the entire climate changes. Sometimes you are living in spring. Sometimes you are living inside a hurricane. Sometimes you are living through winter. The house is the same. Your experience inside the house changes dramatically. That metaphor is not perfect, but it captures something important. The person's life may remain objectively similar, while their internal experience becomes profoundly different. And because bipolar 1 requires a manic episode, understanding mania will be central to understanding this diagnosis. Before we get there, we need to distinguish bipolar 1 from another diagnosis that is often minimized, bipolar 2 disorder. Bipolar 2 disorder is probably one of the most misunderstood diagnoses in all of psychiatry. Even among people who are somewhat familiar with bipolar disorder. Many people describe it as mild bipolar. That description sounds simple. It is also misleading. Hypomania, by definition, is less severe than mania. That part is true. But bipolar 2 disorder itself is not simply a mild illness. In many cases, the depressive episodes are longer, more impairing, and occupy much more of the person's life than the periods of elevation. A person may spend months struggling to function, only to experience several days of increased energy, productivity, confidence, and reduced need for sleep. Guess which state usually brings them to treatment? The depression, not the hypomania. Because depression hurts, hypomania often feels helpful. That creates one of the greatest diagnostic challenges clinicians face. The person does not say, I think I experienced hypomania. They say, I do not know why I keep becoming depressed. The clinician has to ask entirely different questions. Have there ever been periods when you needed much less sleep, were unusually productive, talked much more than usual, felt unusually confident, started multiple projects, spent more money, took risks that were unlike you, became noticeably more social, felt unusually creative? Here is where it becomes psychologically fascinating. The person may answer, those were actually some of the best weeks of my life. That answer should stop us because something can feel psychologically rewarding while still representing a clinical symptom. That is one of the recurring themes you will notice throughout this masterclass. Not every symptom feels like suffering while it is happening. Sometimes it feels like relief. And that reality creates one of the greatest paradoxes in bipolar disorder. People naturally seek relief. If you have spent weeks or months moving through depression, questioning yourself, feeling exhausted, struggling to experience pleasure, and then one morning you wake up feeling energetic, confident, creative, motivated, and alive again, why would you immediately assume something is wrong? Most people would not. Most people would assume they are finally getting better. That is one reason bipolar 2 disorder can remain undiagnosed for years. The depression is experienced as the illness. The hypomania is experienced as recovery. The clinician, however, is listening for something different. They are asking, was this your normal personality returning? Or was this a distinct different psychological state? That distinction matters because healthy recovery restores your usual functioning. Hypomania creates a noticeable departure from it. The person may become unusually social, exceptionally productive, more flirtatious, more talkative, more optimistic, more confident. They may finally begin cleaning the house, starting businesses, writing books, creating content, applying for jobs, calling old friends, making plans. At first glance, everything appears positive. People compliment them. You seem happier. You have your spark back. I wish I had your energy. The praise can unintentionally reinforce the episode. No one realizes they may be encouraging a psychological acceleration that could eventually become difficult to regulate. That does not mean productivity is a symptom. It means productivity must be understood in context. Healthy productivity generally remains connected to judgment. It respects sleep. It evaluates consequences. It allows rest. It prioritizes. It adjusts when circumstances change. Hypomanic productivity can carry a different quality. The person begins saying yes to everything. Ideas multiply faster than they can realistically evaluate them. The calendar fills. Money leaves the account. Projects accumulate. Commitment increases. Sleep decreases. And because the person may still appear functional, the underlying psychological shift can remain hidden. This is why bipolar 2 disorder deserves much more respect than the phrase mild bipolar. It can quietly reshape careers, relationships, financial decisions, and identity. Without the dramatic hospitalization people often associate with bipolar 1, for the diagnosis of bipolar 2 disorder, there must be a history of at least one hypomanic episode and at least one major depressive episode. With no history of a manic episode, if a manic episode has ever occurred, the diagnosis is bipolar 1 disorder. That distinction is not based on which diagnosis sounds more serious. It is based on the kinds of episodes the person has experienced. Now, let's move further along the spectrum. Imagine living your life feeling as though your emotional and energetic baseline is almost never completely stable. Not dramatically unstable. Not enough to consistently meet the full criteria for mania. Not enough to consistently meet the full criteria for major depression, but enough that your life begins organizing itself around unpredictability. That is much closer to cyclothymic disorder. Cyclothymic disorder involves numerous periods of hypomanic symptoms and numerous periods of depressive symptoms that do not meet full criteria for hypomanic episodes or major depressive episodes. For adults, this pattern continues for at least 2 years. For children and adolescents, at least 1 year. During that period, the symptoms are present for a substantial amount of time, and the person is not without them for extended stretches. Notice something important. Time matters. Psychiatric diagnosis really depends upon isolated moments. It depends upon patterns unfolding over time. Someone living with cyclothymic disorder may say, I have always been this way. My mood is just all over the place. I never know which version of me is going to wake up. Friends may describe them as unpredictable. Family members may begin walking on eggshells. Co-workers may notice inconsistent performance. Some periods, they are energetic, creative, engaged, optimistic. Other periods, they withdraw, become discouraged, less motivation, question themselves. Neither side consistently reaches the threshold required for bipolar 1 or bipolar 2 disorder. Yet, the instability itself begins creating impairment. Think about what unpredictability does to a person's identity. If you never know what your motivation will be next month, how confidently can you make long-term plans? If you do not know whether your energy will remain available, how difficult does commitment become? How do you decide whether your current confidence represents genuine readiness or another temporary shift? Over time, many people stop trusting themselves, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack discipline, because consistency has become difficult to predict. That psychological uncertainty deserves attention. Sometimes people living with cyclothymic disorder are criticized for lacking commitment. But commitment requires some confidence that today's psychological resources will remain reasonably available tomorrow. When your internal landscape repeatedly changes, commitment itself can begin feeling risky. This is one reason understanding diagnosis matters. Not to excuse behavior, to accurately understand the psychological environment from which behavior emerges. Not every clinically significant bipolar presentation fits neatly into bipolar 1, bipolar 2, or cyclothymic disorder. Mental health is rarely that tidy. Some people experience clear bipolar symptoms that cause distress or impairment, but the pattern does not meet every requirement for one of the more specific diagnoses. Perhaps the period of elevation is shorter than the typical duration threshold. Perhaps there is not enough available information to determine the exact presentation. Perhaps the clinician can identify why the full criteria are not met. In other situations, the clinician may know that a bipolar spectrum condition is likely, but not have enough information to specify why it does not meet a more precise category. These distinctions are not ways of saying nothing is wrong. They acknowledge that clinically meaningful suffering does not always arrive in a perfectly organized diagnostic package. The diagnostic system attempts to describe reality. Reality is not obligated to arrange itself around the diagnostic system. That is why responsible assessment requires both structure and humility. Some people develop manic or hypomanic symptoms in connection with the substance, a prescribed medication, or another treatment, stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine, steroids, and certain other medications can produce changes in mood, energy, sleep, judgment, and reality testing. A person may begin talking rapidly, sleeping very little, feeling unusually powerful, becoming impulsive, agitated, grandiose, or psychotic. At first glance, the presentation may resemble primary bipolar disorder, but timing matters. Did the symptoms begin during intoxication, during withdrawal, after starting a medication, after increasing a dose? Did the symptoms continue beyond the expected physiological effects? Was there a previous history of mood episodes without the substance? Those questions matter because similar looking symptoms can have different causes, and different causes may require different treatment decisions. Certain medical conditions can also produce manic, hypomanic, or bipolar-like symptoms. Neurological conditions, thyroid disease, brain injuries, other medical illnesses affecting systems involved in mood regulation. This is why responsible clinicians never stop at pattern recognition. Imagine someone arriving in an emergency department, talking rapidly, sleeping very little, appearing grandiose, and behaving impulsively. A careless clinician immediately says, bipolar disorder. A careful clinician asks, what else could explain this presentation? Because psychology never exists independently from biology. The brain belongs to the body. Medical conditions matter. Sleep matters. Substances matter. Context matters. Good assessment is never simply recognizing symptoms. It is ruling out reasonable alternatives before arriving at conclusions. This protects people from inaccurate diagnoses. It also protects treatment. Treating steroid-induced mania exactly like primary bipolar 1 disorder may overlook the underlying contributor. Treating thyroid dysfunction as though it were purely psychiatric misses is essential medical care. Psychology requires humility. The goal is not proving that we are right. The goal is understanding reality as accurately as possible. Now, with the bipolar spectrum established, we are ready to examine the experience that defines bipolar 1 disorder, mania. And before I explain the DSM-5 TR criteria, I want to challenge one of the biggest misconceptions you will ever hear. Mania is not simply extreme happiness. If someone asks the average person to describe mania, they will probably say something like this: someone who is really happy, someone who is full of energy, someone who is excited. These descriptions contain tiny pieces of the truth, but they are nowhere near enough. Because mania is not defined by happiness. Some manic episodes are euphoric. Others are dominated by irritability, agitation, anger, suspicion, hostility, restlessness, or psychological intensity that feels almost impossible to regulate. The common thread is not joy. The common thread is a sustained abnormal change in mood and energy, accompanied by significant changes in thinking, behavior, judgment, sleep, and functioning. The DSM-5 TR describes a manic episode as a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, and abnormally and persistently increased activity or energy, lasting at least 1 week and present most of the day, nearly every day. If hospitalization becomes necessary, the full 1 week duration is not required. Severity has already established that this is not ordinary elevation. During that period, the person must experience at least 3 additional manic symptoms. If the mood is only irritable rather than elevated or expansive, at least 4 additional symptoms are required. That detail matters because diagnosis is not based on someone being energetic, confident, or sleeping less in isolation. It requires a cluster of changes occurring together. Those symptoms include inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, decreased need for sleep, increased talkativeness or pressured speech, racing thoughts or flight of ideas, distractibility, increased goal-directed activity or psychomotor agitation, and excessive involvement in activities with a high potential for pain consequences. We are going to examine every one of those symptoms, but I do not want you merely memorizing a list. I want you to understand 4 layers. What the symptom means clinically, what other people may see, what the person may experience internally, and what psychological process may be operating underneath it. Because the list tells you what happened, the psychology helps explain why it felt true. Notice what the definition does not say. It does not say the person felt good. It describes an organized psychological state. Mood changes, energy changes, behavior changes, functioning changes, and sometimes reality testing changes. Now let's understand those symptoms one by one. Not simply what they are, but what they may actually feel like from inside the person's experience. One of the hallmark symptoms of mania is inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. Most people hear the word grandiosity and immediately picture arrogance. Someone believing they are better than everyone else. Sometimes that is part of the presentation. But psychologically, grandiosity is often much more complicated. Let's begin with healthy confidence. Healthy confidence remains connected to evidence. It can acknowledge limitations. It can receive feedback. It can admit mistakes. It can tolerate uncertainty. It says, I believe I can accomplish this. Grandiosity gradually moves somewhere different. It begins replacing possibility with certainty. The person does not simply believe they have potential. They know, not because evidence has increased, because certainty itself has increased. They begin believing extraordinary success is inevitable, that financial risk no longer applies to them, that failure belongs to other people. Some begin believing they have discovered revolutionary ideas. Others believe they possess unusual spiritual insight. Others believe they have spiritual relationships with influential people. Others become convinced extraordinary wealth is right around the corner. The specific content differs. The psychological process is remarkably similar. Here is the part that fascinates me. Grandiosity often begins where chronic self-doubt disappears. Think about that. Imagine someone who has spent years questioning themselves, second-guessing decisions, feeling inadequate, feeling behind, feeling invisible. Then suddenly, those doubts disappear, not gradually, almost overnight. How would that feel? For many people, it will feel incredible. It will feel like freedom. It will feel like finally becoming the person they always believed they were capable of becoming. That is why grandiosity can become so psychologically persuasive. The person is not simply protecting an unrealistic belief. They may believe they are protecting the first version of themselves who finally feels like enough. This is one of those moments I want both groups listening to hear. If you live with bipolar disorder, You may be thinking, I have never heard anyone explain it that way. If you love someone with bipolar disorder, I want you to notice something. When you challenge the grandiosity, you believe you are questioning an idea. The person may experience you as questioning their identity. You say, I do not think this business plan is realistic. They hear, I do not believe in you. You say, maybe you should slow down. They hear, go back to being the insecure person you used to be. You say, I am worried. They hear, I liked you better when you doubted yourself. Do you see how two people can leave the exact same conversation believing completely different things happen? That is because behavior is never interpreted independently from psychological state. The meaning changes with the state, and that is one of the reasons mania becomes so difficult to interpret once it gains momentum. Grandiosity can also intensify beyond exaggerated confidence. The person may believe they possess extraordinary ability, special authority, unique knowledge, divine selection, or a level of influence that is not supported by reality. At that point, we may be moving toward psychotic grandiosity. The belief is no longer simply overconfident. Reality testing may be significantly impaired, but not every instance of grandiosity is psychotic. A person can hold dramatically inflated beliefs while still maintaining some connection to shared reality. Severity exists along a continuum. The clinician must determine not simply whether confidence increased, but how far it moved from baseline, how firmly the beliefs are held, how the person responds to evidence, and what consequences have followed. If I had to choose one symptom that I wish every person living with bipolar disorder, every family member, every spouse, every parent, every clinician paid closer attention to, it would be sleep. Because sleep is often one of the earliest windows into what the brain is doing. Notice I did not say one of the earliest symptoms. I said one of the earliest windows. Sleep does not just reflect bipolar disorder. It can influence it. And understanding the difference between insomnia and a decreased need for sleep is absolutely critical. Those two experiences are not the same. With insomnia, the person wants to sleep. They are tired. They get into bed. They close their eyes. They may even feel exhausted, but sleep will not come, or it comes in fragments. They wake repeatedly. They toss and turn. They are frustrated because they know they need rest. Sleep feels unavailable. Now compare that to mania. The person sleeps 3 hours, sometimes 2, occasionally none, yet wakes up saying, I feel amazing. I have plenty of energy. I do not need any more sleep. I have always needed too much sleep anyway. I finally figured out how to maximize my time. Notice the psychological difference. The problem is not simply that sleep will not happen. The person no longer believes they need it. That is a completely different experience. This is one of the first oh snap moments I want you to carry with you. The person may not experience themselves as sleep deprived. They may experience themselves as finally being free from sleep. Sleep begins feeling inefficient, almost inconvenient, almost like an interruption. Imagine believing I have the greatest ideas I have ever had, and you are asking me to go unconscious for 8 hours. From inside the episode, sleep can begin feeling like an obstacle standing between the person and what they believe they are supposed to accomplish. They may begin writing, cleaning, researching, investing, creating, calling people, planning businesses, studying, driving, building, organizing, creating content. Not because someone forced them, because internally, everything feels too important to postpone. The family says, you need some rest. The person hears, you need to stop becoming who you are becoming. Again, notice the different meanings. The family sees sleep loss. The person sees purpose. The family sees exhaustion coming. The person sees opportunity. The family sees danger. The person sees momentum. That psychological mismatch explains why these conversations become so emotionally charged. The spouse is not simply asking someone to sleep. They are unknowingly asking someone to interrupt what may feel like the most meaningful period of their life. And the person is not simply refusing bedtime. They may genuinely believe stopping now would be irresponsible. That is why arguing about sleep often goes nowhere. You are discussing biology. They are experiencing destiny. Now, here is another layer. Sleep is not only a symptom, it can become an accelerant. The episode begins. The person sleeps less. The brain becomes increasingly dysregulated. Judgment declines further. Thinking accelerates further. Emotion intensifies further, which may lead to even less sleep. The episode begins feeding itself. Think of it like a snowball rolling downhill. At first, the change seems manageable. I am just sleeping a little less. A few days later, the momentum has increased. Another few days, the person may already be functioning from a dramatically altered psychological state. This is why clinicians often ask detailed questions about sleep before asking about many other symptoms. Not because sleep explains everything, but because changes in sleep frequently announce that something larger may already be happening. Families often ask, when should we become concerned? There is no single number that applies to everyone. The better question is, what is normal for this person? If someone has always needed 7 or 8 hours and suddenly functions on 3 while insisting they have never felt better, pay attention. Not panic, pay attention. Because bipolar disorder is often easier to recognize at the level of patterns than at the level of crisis. By the time crisis arrives, the pattern has usually been unfolding for some time. Sleep is often one of the first chapters of that story. Have you ever been around someone and before they finished one sentence, they have already started another? Before you answer their question, they are asking the next one. Before you have processed the first idea, they are already explaining the fourth. That can happen for many reasons. Anxiety, excitement, personality, ADHD. But during mania, the quality of speech often changes in a very specific way. The DSM calls it pressured speech. I appreciate that word, pressured, because it tells us something about the internal experience. The words do not simply come out quickly. They feel like they have to. The person may experience an internal pressure to keep speaking, to keep explaining, to keep connecting ideas, to keep moving. Silence begins feeling uncomfortable. Pauses begin feeling wasteful. The person may interrupt repeatedly, not necessarily because they are intentionally disrespectful, because waiting becomes psychologically difficult. Imagine having 5 thoughts arriving every second, while the conversation only allows one sentence every several seconds. The bottleneck becomes frustrating. The person may think, if I do not say this now, I will lose it. Or they are not understanding how important this is. And again, notice the psychological experience. From the listener's perspective, the person will not stop talking. From the speaker's perspective, they are trying desperately to communicate something that feels extraordinarily important. That difference matters. Families sometimes say, he will not let anybody else talk. She dominates every conversation. Sometimes that is behaviorally accurate, but I also want you to appreciate what it may feel like internally. The mind is generating ideas faster than normal conversation can accommodate them. Conversation feeling slow. Imagine trying to pour 5 gallons of water through a 1-gallon funnel. Pressure develops. That is the image I want you to remember. Not because the analogy is perfect, because it captures the feeling. Now, here is something else. People often assume pressured speech means the person is saying nonsense. Not necessarily. Many manic conversations begin making perfect sense. The ideas may even be insightful, creative, interesting. That is what can make the experience so deceptive. The issue is not always the quality of the individual ideas. It is the speed, the volume, the certainty, the inability to pause, and eventually the person's decreasing ability to evaluate which ideas actually deserve immediate expression. Another important distinction. People sometimes confuse talking a lot with pressured speech. Those are not automatically the same. Someone may simply enjoy conversation. Someone may naturally be extroverted. Someone may tell long stories. Pressured speech carries a different quality. It feels driven, almost propelled, as though the words themselves are pushing outward. The listener may begin feeling exhausted, not because the conversation lacks intelligence, because there is almost no psychological space left for dialogue. Conversation slowly becomes monologue. The person asks questions, then answers them before anyone else can. They begin several stories simultaneously. Their speech becomes increasingly difficult to interrupt, not necessarily because they do not care what you think, because their own mind has become increasingly difficult for them to interrupt. That sentence is worth repeating. The listener struggles to interrupt the conversation because the speaker may be struggling to interrupt their own thinking. That is a completely different way of understanding the behavior. It invites compassion without pretending the behavior is not disruptive. One of the themes you are probably beginning to notice is that almost every symptom has two realities: the external behavior and the internal experience. The external behavior is what people judge. The internal experience is what often gets overlooked. Grow Yourself Great is about understanding both, because behavior without psychology creates stereotypes. Psychology without behavior ignores consequences. We need both. Now, what happens when thoughts themselves begin accelerating? That is where we move next, into one of the most recognizable and one of the most fascinating features of mania: racing thoughts and flight of ideas. If you have never experienced racing thoughts, it is tempting to imagine them as simply thinking fast. But that description is too small. Thinking fast can happen when you are excited, when you are solving a problem, when you are preparing for an interview, when you are creating something meaningful. Healthy thinking speeds up all the time. Racing thoughts are different. Imagine standing beside a freeway. Cars continue passing, one after another, fast. Now imagine there are no lanes anymore. Cars are moving in every direction at different speeds. Some are merging. Some are exiting. Some are changing direction unexpectedly. Some are arriving before you have ever noticed the last one. That begins to resemble what some people describe during mania. The mind is not simply producing more thoughts. It begins producing thoughts faster than they can be organized, faster than they can be evaluated, faster than they can be completed. This is one of the reasons people living with mania often describe feeling mentally energized, while simultaneously becoming increasingly difficult to follow. Here's why. The listener only hears the words. The speaker experiences the connections. Imagine I say, I should start a business. Then immediately say, artificial intelligence is changing education. Then I should move to another state. Then I have always wanted to write a book. Then I think cryptocurrency is about to explode. The listener hears unrelated topics. The speaker often experiences an invisible chain connecting every one of them. Their mind may have traveled through 20 intermediate ideas that were never spoken aloud. By the time the words leave their mouth, they have already completed an entire internal conversation that no one else had access to. This creates one of the most frustrating experiences for families. They think that came out of nowhere. The person thinks, I have been thinking about this for an hour. Both are telling the truth. One observed the words, the other experienced the thought process. This is where we also distinguish between racing thoughts and flight of ideas. They are related, but they are not identical. Racing thoughts describe the person's internal experience. My mind will not slow down. I cannot turn my brain off. It is like everything is happening at once. I have too many ideas. Flight of ideas is something other people can observe. The conversation begins jumping rapidly from one subject to another. Connections become increasingly difficult to follow. The person often remains convinced everything they are saying fits together perfectly. Sometimes it does. Sometimes the links become increasingly loose. The conversation starts here, moves there, returns somewhere else, branches again, then circles back to something mentioned 20 minutes earlier. To everyone else, it can feel disorganized. To the speaker, it feels completely logical. That difference becomes critically important. Remember something we have already discussed? One hallmark of mania is that insight often decreases. So if the conversation feels perfectly logical to the speaker, they are unlikely to appreciate why everyone else appears confused. In fact, they may become irritated. They may think, why can't you keep up? Or I have explained this 3 times. From their perspective, they have. The problem is that the explanation often depended on internal associations that were never verbal. Now let's go one layer deeper. Why do racing thoughts often feel good at first? Because many people experience them as increased intelligence. Imagine waking up one morning and ideas seem to arrive effortlessly. Problems that felt impossible suddenly seem obvious. Connections appear everywhere. Creativity increases. You feel mentally alive. You begin thinking, this is who I was supposed to be. That sentence, this is who I was supposed to be, is one of the most psychologically significant experiences many people describe. They do not experience the episode as becoming someone different. They experience it as finally becoming themselves. Let that sink in. Family members often say they are acting like a different person. The individual may be thinking, no, for the first time, I am acting like the real me. Do you see why conflict develops? They are not arguing over behavior. They are arguing over identity. The family wants the person back. The person believes they have finally arrived. That is a completely different conversation, and one that cannot be understood by looking only at symptoms. Now, there is another consequence of racing thoughts that does not receive enough attention: decision making. Most people have experienced distraction. You are reading, your phone vibrates, you look, you forgot what you were reading. That is ordinary distraction. The distractibility seen during mania often has a different quality. Imagine every new piece of information suddenly feels important. A notification, a bird outside, a memory, a business idea, a conversation happening across the room, a headline, a text message, someone laughing, music playing. Everything competes equally for attention. The mind begins treating possibility as urgency. One idea interrupts another, which interrupts another. which interrupts another. The person's attention does not simply wander. It becomes magnetized by novelty. Here is why that matters psychologically. Attention is one of the brain's ways of deciding. This matters. When everything feels meaningful, attention becomes increasingly difficult to regulate. The person is not intentionally refusing to focus. The brain has begun assigning unusually high value to far more stimuli than usual. Imagine trying to have one conversation while 20 people are simultaneously offering you opportunities. Every voice sounds important. Every possibility deserves consideration. Every thought feels worth following. This helps explain why projects multiply, not because the person lacks discipline, because every new idea genuinely feels valuable. They may begin cleaning the garage, then discover an old notebook. The notebook reminds them of a business idea. The business idea reminds them to research marketing. Marketing reminds them they should build a website. While building the website, they decide they should learn graphic design. While watching graphic design videos, they remember they wanted to write a screenplay. Hours later, the garage remains unfinished, not because they were lazy, because the mind continually reassigned importance. Family members sometimes become frustrated. You never finish anything. The person often becomes frustrated too, because every unfinished project once felt absolutely worth beginning again. Notice the pattern. Behavior alone creates judgment. Psychology creates understanding. Understanding does not eliminate accountability, but it changes how we interpret what we are seeing. Distractibility can also become dangerous. The person may be driving, but attention keeps moving toward billboards, music, messages, ideas, or people outside the car. They may begin one task at work, then respond to 6 unrelated impulses. They may lose track of conversations, forget commitments, misplace items, or fail to complete important responsibilities. From the outside, it can look careless. From the inside, the mind feels flooded with significance. Too many things feel important at once. And when everything is important, priority begins disappearing. That is the mechanism underneath it. Not a lack of interest, an inability to keep one thing psychologically dominant long enough to complete it. This symptom is one of the reasons bipolar disorder can fool both the individual and everyone around them. Because on the surface, it often looks admirable. The person becomes productive, extremely productive. The house gets clean, businesses get started, books begin getting written, music gets recorded, plans get made, emails get answered, ideas become action. People around them may even become inspired. I wish I had that kind of motivation. I have never seen them this focused. They are finally reaching their potential. Sometimes, for a while, it really does look that way. This is why recognizing mania requires looking beyond productivity. We have a cultural bias. We tend to assume that more productivity is always healthier. Psychologically, that is not always true. Healthy productivity respects limits. It includes rest. It tolerates unfinished work. It prioritizes. It evaluates consequences. It asks, should I? Not simply, can I? Manic productivity often loses that second question. The person becomes increasingly driven toward action. Everything begins feeling urgent. Everything begins feeling possible. Everything begins feeling necessary. The list of goals grows faster than life can realistically accommodate. One business becomes 3. One investment becomes 7. One home project becomes 12. One degree becomes 2. One relationship becomes several. The issue is not ambition. Ambition is healthy. The issue is regulation. Can the person stop? Can they pause? Can they postpone? Can they tolerate leaving something unfinished? Or does every opportunity immediately become an obligation? That is an important psychological distinction because eventually the activity begins organizing the person instead of the person organizing the activity. Think about that carefully. Healthy people organize their pursuits. During mania, the pursuits often begin organizing the person. Momentum replaces intentionality. Action replaces evaluation. Movement begins feeling like meaning. This is one of the reasons people often describe feeling exhausted after an episode ends. They are not only recovering biologically, they are returning to a life filled with commitments made by a mind functioning under a completely different psychological state. The bills remain. The purchases remain. The promises remain. The relationships remain. The projects remain. The consequences remain. The episode may end. Its effects often do not. Increased activity can also be social. The person may call people constantly, reconnect with old friends, attend multiple events, become unusually flirtatious, approach strangers, make plans every night. They may feel more connected than they have in years. Again, the change may initially feel healthy, especially if the person has recently experienced depression or isolation. The problem becomes visible when the activity is no longer regulated by sleep, judgment, capacity, or consequence. The person is not merely doing more. They are losing the ability to decide when enough is enough. Excessive involvement in high-risk activities. One of the most consequential features of mania is excessive involvement in activities with a high potential for painful consequences. People often hear that criterion and immediately think spending, sex, drugs, and yes, those can absolutely be part of it. But the deeper psychological issue is larger. Something can happen to the person's relationship with consequence itself. That distinction matters because if we reduce this symptom to a list of reckless behaviors, we miss the psychology underneath them. A person may spend thousands of dollars they cannot afford, invest their savings into an untested business, open multiple credit cards, purchase expensive equipment, quit a stable job without a realistic plan, drive recklessly, travel impulsively, gamble, use substances, enter sexual situations they will ordinarily avoid, have affairs, share intimate information publicly, confront people aggressively, sign contracts without carefully reading them, give away possessions or money, make enormous commitments after knowing someone for only a short time. From the outside, the question seems obvious. What were you thinking? But that question assumes something important. It assumes the person was evaluating risk from the same psychological position they normally would. They may not have been. The person may still intellectually understand that consequences exist. They know credit cards have to be repaid. They know relationships can end. They know businesses can fail. They know speeding can cause accidents. They know unprotected sex can have consequences. The information may still exist. What changes is the emotional weight assigned to that information. The consequence no longer feels probable enough to matter or powerful enough to compete with the reward. This is an important distinction. Knowing something and emotionally believing it applies to you are not always the same thing. You can know statistically that businesses fail while feeling absolutely certain yours cannot. You can know debt exists while believing future wealth will make current spending irrelevant. You can understand that relationships have boundaries while feeling entitled to an exception because the current connection feels extraordinary. You can know something is dangerous while experiencing yourself as unusually protected from danger. The knowledge has not necessarily disappeared. Its authority has. That is the psychological shift. And this gives us another important oh snap moment. Sometimes during mania, the future does not disappear. It becomes too optimistic to function as a warning. Think about that. People often assume impulsive behavior means someone is not thinking about tomorrow. Sometimes they are thinking about tomorrow. They just believe tomorrow is going to be extraordinary. I will make the money back. This business is going to explode. I am getting a huge opportunity soon. This relationship is meant to happen. Everything is about to change. The future exists, but it has been psychologically recruited to justify the present. That is very different from simply not caring. Most healthy decision making requires us to distinguish between three things: something being possible, something being probable, and something being certain. Those are not the same. Could I start a business and become successful? Possible. Does that mean success is guaranteed? No. Could I write a book that becomes internationally successful? Possible. Does believing strongly in the book make the outcome certain? No. Could I meet someone and eventually build a meaningful relationship? Absolutely. Does feeling intensely connected after 3 days prove this person is my soulmate? No. Healthy judgment leaves room between possibility and certainty. Mania can begin collapsing that space. Possible starts feeling probable. Probable starts feeling inevitable. And once something feels inevitable, risk changes meaning. Why worry about spending $20,000 if you know you are about to make $2 million? Why remain at a job you dislike if you know your new company will succeed? Why listen to skeptical family members if you know they simply cannot see what you see yet? Inside that logic, the behavior can feel completely rational. The problem is that the certainty is not adequately anchored to evidence. This is why arguing only about the behavior may fail. The behavior makes sense inside the belief system supporting it. If I truly believed with absolute certainty that I would receive $10 million, spending $50,000 today would feel very different. You cannot fully understand the spending without understanding the certainty. You cannot fully understand the risk without understanding how the person is experiencing the future. Financial behavior deserves particular attention because money can convert a temporary psychological state into consequences lasting for years. During mania, money may stop feeling like a limited resource. The person may feel unusually generous. They buy gifts, pay for other people, donate large amounts, purchase luxury items, invest in businesses, buy equipment for new projects, book travel, upgrade vehicle, make major purchases. The purchases often have an internal story. That is important. From the outside, they bought $8,000 worth of equipment. From the inside, I am building the company that is going to change my life. From the outside, they gave away thousands of dollars. From the inside, I finally understand that abundance comes back when you give. From the outside, they bought things they cannot afford. From the inside, I am investing in the person I am becoming. Do you hear the difference? The behavior is attached to meaning. That meaning can make intervention difficult. If the family says you need to stop spending, the person may hear, you do not believe in my future. This does not mean the family should allow financial destruction. Absolutely not. It means Effective prevention often requires safeguards created before judgment becomes significantly impaired. Spending alerts, shared financial agreements, temporary limits, trusted support, clear thresholds for intervention, because trying to negotiate financial restraint in the middle of severe mania can be like trying to install brakes after the car is already moving at 100 miles an hour. The best intervention often begins before the crisis. This is an area people sometimes avoid because it can be uncomfortable. But if we are going to understand bipolar disorder completely, we cannot skip it. Some people experience increased sexual drive during mania or hypomania. They may feel more attractive, more confident, more socially bold, more interested in sexual experiences, more willing to initiate contact, more likely to pursue novelty, and less inhibited by consequences. For someone who ordinarily experiences shame, social anxiety, body insecurity, or fear of rejection, this can feel incredibly liberating. Again, the symptom may initially feel like freedom. A person who normally questions whether anyone finds them attractive may suddenly feel intensely desirable. They may flirt more, use dating apps more frequently, contact former partners, engage in multiple sexual relationships, have sex in situations they will ordinarily consider unsafe, or violate relationship agreements. Later, when the episode resolves, the person may experience profound shame. What did I do? Why did I do that? That is not who I am. This creates an external important distinction. Understanding the role of mania may explain how judgment and inhibition became altered. It does not erase the impact on other people. If a partner was betrayed, the partner was still betrayed. If someone was exposed to risk, the risk still existed. If boundaries were violated, repair may still be necessary. Clinical understanding and accountability can exist in the same room. They have to. Otherwise, we make one of two mistakes. We either moralize everything or ignore illness, or we medicalize everything and ignore impact. Neither is psychologically mature. The more useful position is this behavior occurred during a state in which judgment and inhibition were impaired, and the consequences still matter. Both can be true. Think about all the things you do not do every day, not because you never think about them, because something inside you says, probably not worth it. Think about tomorrow. That could hurt someone. That is too expensive. That is unsafe. That will create a problem. We rarely appreciate inhibition because inhibition is invisible. You notice the behavior you perform. You do not usually notice the 1,000 behaviors your brain quietly prevented. That internal braking system is part of healthy self-regulating. During mania, those brakes can weaken. The idea appears, and the distance between thought and action becomes shorter. That may be one of the clearest ways to understand impulsive manic behavior. The person does not necessarily stop having thoughts about consequences. There is simply less psychological distance available for those consequences to interrupt action, thought, urgency, action, instead of thought, pause, evaluation, decision. That missing pause can change a life. One purchase, one sexual encounter, one confrontation, one resignation letter, one social media post, one drive, one investment, one decision made in minutes can create consequences lasting years. This is why treatment is not simply about controlling mood. It is also about protecting the person's future from decisions made during temporary states. That is stewardship. We will return to that idea later. Increased goal-directed activity is not always productive looking. Sometimes the energy has nowhere coherent to go. The person paces, moves constantly, cannot sit through a conversation, walks from room to room, starts one thing, stops, starts another, their body feels charged. They may say, I have to do something, but when asked what, they cannot clearly answer. Stillness becomes almost intolerable. This is psychomotor agitation, and it matters because people sometimes assume increased movement means increased motivation, not necessarily. Sometimes movement is the physical expression of internal dysregulation. The body is activated without a stable destination. Imagine pressing the accelerator while the steering wheel keeps changing direction. There is enormous movement, but movement does not necessarily equal progress. That distinction applies too much of mania. Activity is not automatically productivity. Confidence is not automatically competence. Certainty is not automatically truth. Intensity is not automatically important. And energy is not automatically wellness. Those distinctions are essential because mania can take experiences our culture normally celebrates: confidence, productivity, creativity, ambition, energy, and amplify them beyond the point where they remain adaptive. The problem is not the quality itself. The problem is regulation. Now, we need to understand what separates mania from hypomania, because the difference is not simply mania is really strong hypomania. Severity matters in a very specific way. A manic episode causes marked impairment in social or occupational functioning, or requires hospitalization to prevent harm to the person or others, or includes psychotic features. Let's unpack that. Marked impairment means the episode is substantially disrupting the person's ability to function. They may lose their job, become unable to maintain relationships, make dangerous financial decisions, become severely disorganized, behave in ways that create significant legal or safety concerns. The person may still believe they are functioning exceptionally well. That is another paradox. Subjective experience and objective functioning can move in opposite directions. The person says, I have never been more productive. The employer says they have stopped completing their actual work. The person says, my relationships are better than ever. Their spouse is considering leaving. The person says, my finances are about to explode. Their accounts are overdrawn. The person says, everyone finally respects me. Friends have stopped answering calls. This is why self-report alone may not always capture the severity of mania. Not because the person is intentionally dishonest, because the episode itself may alter how they evaluate their functioning. Collateral information can become extremely important. A spouse, parent, sibling, friend, coworker, someone who knows the person's baseline, not to override the person, to complete the picture. Because if your mind is currently telling you that everything is going extraordinarily well, you may not accurately recognize how much has already begun falling apart. Sometimes mania becomes severe enough that hospitalization is necessary. This may happen because the person cannot reliably protect themselves. They are engaging in dangerous behavior. They have become severely disorganized. They are not sleeping. They are increasingly agitated. They may be aggressive. They may be wandering, driving dangerously, giving away money, entering unsafe situations, or losing contact with reality. Hospitalization can be deeply traumatic for some people, especially when they do not believe they are ill. Imagine this experience. You believe you have finally discovered your purpose. You feel powerful, clear, alive, maybe spiritually awakened, maybe destined for something extraordinary. Then suddenly, people you love are telling professionals you are sick. Your belongings may be taken. Your freedom may be restricted. You are placed in an unfamiliar environment. You are asked questions you think are ridiculous. You are offered medication you believe you do not need. From the clinician's perspective, this is treatment. From the person's perspective, it may feel like betrayal. That does not mean hospitalization is wrong when safety requires it. It means we need to understand why the person may emerge from hospitalization angry, humiliated, confused, or distrustful. We cannot assume that because treatment was clinically necessary, the experience automatically felt caring. Both truths can exist. The intervention may have saved someone's life, and the person may still need help processing how frightening or disempowering it felt. That is part of recovery too. Now, I want to destroy another stereotype. Mania does not always look happy. Sometimes it looks angry. The DSM allows manic mood to be elevated, expansive, or irritable. The last word matters, irritable. Some people do not become tearful during mania. They become increasingly intolerant. Everything feels too slow. Other people seem incompetent. Questions feel unnecessary. Delays feel unbearable. Boundaries feel insulting. Disagreement feels like obstruction. The person may think, why is everyone getting in my way? Think about the psychology. Your mind is moving rapidly. Your confidence is elevated. Your goals feel urgent. Your ideas feel obvious. Then someone says, wait, that one word can feel intolerable because internally, nothing feels like it should wait. The person may become argumentative, verbally aggressive, threatening, or physically aggressive. Again, understanding does not excuse harm, but understanding helps explain why seemingly minor obstacles can produce disproportionately intense reactions. The problem may not simply be anger. The person is operating inside a psychological state where urgency has expanded. Patience has contracted, confidence has intensified, and feedback increasingly feels unnecessary. Put those together. An ordinary disagreement can begin feeling like an attack. We also need to understand the word expansive because it appears in the diagnostic definition, but people rarely explain what it actually means. Expansiveness can involve a sense that normal boundaries no longer apply. Social boundaries, financial boundaries, professional boundaries, personal boundaries. The person may become unusually familiar with strangers. They approach people confidently, share intimate information, make enormous promises, offer opportunities, contact influential people, enter spaces they normally would not. They may feel connected to everyone. The world begins feeling unusually open, possible, accessible. Imagine psychological boundaries expanding outward. The person begins occupying more social, emotional, financial, and interpersonal space. They may walk into a room feeling like everyone wants to meet them. They may contact a celebrity believing a collaboration is inevitable. They may approach a stranger and immediately discuss deeply personal subjects. Sometimes this charisma is magnetic. People may genuinely enjoy being around them. That is another complication. Not every consequence of hypomanic or manic behavior is immediately negative. Some people become socially captivating, funny, bold, creative, energetic, generous, persuasive. People respond positively. That social reinforcement can make recognizing the episode even harder because the world may temporarily reward the symptom. That is an important psychological principle. A behavior does not have to produce immediate pain to be part of a maladaptive process. Sometimes the consequences arrive later. This deserves its own discussion. Imagine someone begins sleeping less. They become more productive. Their boss notices. You are killing it this week. They become more social. Friends say, you are finally coming out of your shell. They become confident. People say, I love this new you. They begin creating. Followers increase. They post constantly. Engagement rises. They launch projects. People congratulate them. What message does the environment send? Keep going. Now imagine the person has bipolar disorder. The early phase of the episode may be receiving constant social reinforcement, more work, more attention, more praise, more opportunities, more excitement. Then the episode intensifies. The same behavior that was rewarded yesterday becomes concerning today. Suddenly, everyone says, you need to slow down. Can you imagine how confusing that feels? Yesterday, you celebrated me. Today, you are diagnosing me. Yesterday, my energy was inspiring. Today, it is pathological. Yesterday, you told me to believe in myself. Today, you are saying my confidence is grandiosity. This is one reason early intervention requires nuance. We cannot simply tell people, stop being confident. Stop being ambitious. Stop creating. That would be absurd. The question is not, are you doing something impressive? The question is, what is happening to the system producing the behavior? Are you sleeping? Can you stop? Can you tolerate feedback? Are you making realistic decisions? Are you completing what you start? Are you spending beyond your means? Is your behavior dramatically different from baseline? Are multiple changes occurring together? This is how we distinguish healthy intensity from pathological acceleration. Now that we understand mania, we can understand hypomania much clearly. Hypomania involves the same general categories of symptoms: inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, decreased need for sleep, increased talkativeness, racing thoughts or flight of ideas, distractibility, increased goal-directed activity or psychomotor agitation, excessive involvement in activities with potential pain consequences. The same symptom count rule applies. At least 3 additional symptoms must occur, or 4 when the mood is only irritable. But the episode lasts at least 4 consecutive days, rather than the typical 1-week threshold for mania. And the change is present most of the day, nearly every day. The person is observably different from their usual self. Other people can notice the change. That criterion matters. Hypomania is not simply a private feeling of having a good week. It represents a recognizable departure from baseline. But here is the crucial distinction. Hypomania is not severe enough to cause marked impairment in social or occupational functioning, does not require hospitalization, and does not include psychotic features. If psychosis occurs during an elevated episode, we are no longer talking about hypomania. That episode is manic. That distinction matters enormously for diagnosis, because a history of mania establishes bipolar 1 disorder. A history of hypomania, along with major depressive episodes, and no history of mania supports bipolar 2 disorder. Now let's make this real. Imagine 2 people, both sleep 3 hours, both become unusually confident, both talk more, both start multiple projects, both spend more money. Person A still goes to work. They are usually productive. Their spouse notices they are different, but they remain mostly functional. They make some questionable purchases, but nothing catastrophic. After several days, the state resolves. That may resemble hypomania, depending on the full clinical picture. Now, person B, they stop going to work because they believe they have developed a billion-dollar company. They spend their savings, drive across the country without telling anyone. become increasingly agitated when questioned, and eventually believe the television is sending them personalized instructions. That is not simply more hypomania. The severity has changed the clinical category. Psychosis alone establishes that the elevated episode is manic. Here is one of the most important things to understand about hypomania. It may improve functioning temporarily. Let me read that again. It may improve functioning temporarily. A psychiatric symptom can temporarily improve aspects of functioning. That sounds contradictory. But psychology is full of contradictions. Someone becomes more productive, more confident, more social, more sexually interested, more ambitious. They may outperform themselves at work, create something extraordinary, feel unusually connected to others. So why would they seek treatment? Usually, they do not. They seek treatment later, when depression arrives. This creates an enormous diagnostic blind spot. Imagine someone sees a clinician and says, "I have been depressed for 3 months." The clinician asks about depression: sleep, appetite, energy, suicidal thoughts, concentration. Everything points toward major depression. They receive treatment for depression. But nobody asks, have there been other periods in your life when you needed dramatically less sleep, felt unusually confident, became far more productive, talked much more, or behaved in ways other people thought were unlike you? The hypomania remains invisible, not because it never happened, because nobody thought to ask about the time the person felt good. That is one of the strangest realities in mental health. Sometimes the most diagnostically important information is hidden inside the period the person considered their healthiest. This deserves deeper attention. Some people with bipolar 2 disorder describe hypomania in language that sounds almost like recovery. I finally felt like myself. I finally had confidence. I finally wanted sex again. I finally had ideas. I finally wanted to be around people. I finally got things done. That word finally tells us something. It means the state is being compared to something painful, often depression. If you have been underwater for months, anything that feels like oxygen will be difficult to surrender. This is why telling someone that was not really you, that was just hypomania, can be psychologically devastating. Be careful. The person was still there. Their creativity may be real. Their confidence may reveal capacities they genuinely possess. Their sociability may reflect authentic parts of themselves. The problem is not that everything experienced during hypomania is fake. The problem is that the state may amplify, accelerate, disinhibit, and dysregulate those qualities. That distinction matters. We should not tell someone your creativity was not real. A better question is, how do we help you access creativity without needing pathological acceleration? We should not say, your confidence was fake. Ask, how do we build confidence that survives when the episode ends? We should not say, that energetic person was not you. Ask, how do we build a life where vitality does not require sacrificing sleep, judgment, or stability? Now we are doing more than symptom management. We are helping the person integrate themselves, because recovery should not require someone to amputate every quality they loved about who they were during elevation. Recovery should help them reclaim those qualities in forms they can actually sustain. That brings us to the other pole people often associate with bipolar disorder: depression. But before we move there, we need to correct one major misunderstanding. Bipolar depression is not simply the opposite of mania. If mania was simply happiness, then depression would simply be sadness. But we already know mania is much more than happiness. So bipolar depression must also be understood as much more than sadness. A major depressive episode is a sustained psychological and biological state involving changes in mood, pleasure, sleep, appetite, energy, movement, thinking, self-evaluation, concentration, and sometimes the desire to remain alive. The DSM-5-TR requires at least 5 symptoms during the same 2-week period, representing a clear change from previous functioning. At least one of those symptoms must be either depressed mood or markedly diminished interest or pleasure in nearly all activities. The other possible symptoms include significant changes in appetite or weight, insomnia or excessive sleep, psychomotor agitation or slowing, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt, diminished concentration or indecisiveness, and recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. But just as we did with mania, I do not want you memorizing a list. I want you to understand what these symptoms can feel like, what loved ones may see, and what psychological mechanisms may be operating underneath them. Because depression is one of the conditions where the outside world often sees inactivity, while the person living through it is engaged in an exhausting internal battle no one else can see. Let's begin with depression. Mood. When people hear the word depression, they often imagine sadness, crying, looking down, feeling blue. And yes, sadness can be part of depression, but depression is not always experienced as sadness. Sometimes it feels like emptiness. Nothing reaches you. Nothing moves you. Nothing feels meaningful enough to care about. Sometimes it feels like irritability. Everything gets on your nerves. Sounds feel louder. Requests feel heavier. Other people feel more demanding. Sometimes it feels like emotional numbness. The person knows they should care, but cannot feel themselves caring. They know they love their family, but the emotional experience of love feels distant. They know something good happened, but goodness no longer registers normally. That can be terrifying because sadness still feels like something. Numbness can feel like the absence of yourself. The person may say, I do not feel like me. I do not feel anything. I feel disconnected from everybody. I know I should be grateful, but I cannot feel grateful. Notice what often happens next. The person does not simply experience depression. They begin judging themselves for being depressed. I have a good life. What is wrong with me? My family needs me. Why can't I get myself together? Other people have it worse. I should be stronger than this. Now the person is carrying 2 kinds of pain: the depression itself and the verdict they have rendered against themselves for experiencing it. That second layer often deepens the first because shame rarely motivates a depressed nervous system into wellness. It usually convinces the person that their difficulty says something terrible about who they are. This is one of the most important truths about depression. The mind often turns a temporary state into an identity statement. Instead of I am experiencing depression, it becomes I am weak, I am lazy, I am broken, I am burdened, I am failing. That transformation from state to identity is psychologically dangerous because states can change. Identity statements feel permanent. And once depression convinces someone that the problem is not what they are experiencing, but who they are, hope becomes much more difficult to access. The second core symptom of a major depressive episode is markedly diminished interest or pleasure in nearly all activities. The clinical word is anhedonia. Anhedonia is not simply being bored. It is not needing a vacation. It is not outgrowing a hobby. It is the reduced ability to experience interest, anticipation, or pleasure for things that ordinarily matter. Music plays but does not reach you. Food has flavor but not emotional reward. A loved one hugs you and you understand the meaning of the hug, but cannot fully feel it. You go somewhere you usually enjoy and spend the entire time wondering when you can leave. Someone says, "Come on, you will feel better once you get out." Maybe. But sometimes the goes, participates, smiles when expected, and still feels nothing. That can make depression even lonelier because now they have evidence that even the things that are supposed to help do not seem to work. Anhedonia also affects motivation. People often assume we do things first and then experience pleasure. Psychologically, anticipation usually comes before action. You imagine the food tasting good, so you cook. You anticipate enjoying your friend, so you answer the invitation. You expect accomplishment to feel rewarding, so you begin the task. Pleasure does not only reward behavior after it happens. The expectation of pleasure helps initiate behavior before it begins. Depression disrupts that system. If the mind cannot imagine reward, why begin? If nothing feels likely to matter, why expend energy? This is why telling a depressed person to simply do something enjoyable can miss the point. The difficulty may not be finding an activity. The system that normally predicts enjoyment is no longer functioning the same way. The person remembers that they used to care. They just cannot access the emotional evidence that caring will return. That is a profound form of psychological disconnection, and it creates one of the cruelest features of depression. The person may begin withdrawing from the very experiences that could eventually help reconnect them to life. Not because they reject life, but because life has temporarily stopped producing enough internal reward to pull them toward it. Depression can significantly change appetite. Some people eat much less. Food becomes uninteresting. Preparing a meal feels like much work. They may go most of the day without eating, not because they are intentionally restricting food, but because hunger has lost its urgency. Other people eat more, especially foods that provide immediate comfort. For some people, food becomes one of the few remaining experiences capable of producing temporary relief. That distinction matters. Overeating during depression is not always about lack of discipline. Sometimes it is an attempt to generate feeling in a system where pleasure has become scarce. Food briefly changes the state. It comforts, distracts, soothes, fills time, creates sensation. Then shame often follows. The person eats to escape emotional pain, then uses the eating as evidence against themselves. I have no control. I have let myself go. I cannot do anything right. Again, the symptom becomes a verdict, and that verdict feeds the depression. Changes in appetite may also create physical consequences: weight loss, weight gain, weakness, changes in body image, reduced confidence, medical complications. The depressive episode begins altering not only how the person experiences their body, but how they evaluate it. Depression can produce insomnia or hypersomnia. Some people cannot sleep. They lie awake with thoughts circling, regrets replay, future problems expand. Every unresolved issue seems to arrive after midnight. The body is exhausted, but the mind remains active. Others sleep excessively, 10 hours, 12 hours, sometimes much more. But the sleep does not feel restorative. They wake tired. They return to bed. They may use sleep as temporary disappearance, not necessarily because they want to die, but because unconsciousness offers relief from being present inside the state. That is an important distinction. Sometimes the person is not sleeping because their body needs more rest. They are sleeping because waking life feels emotionally expensive. Every hour awake requires effort, thinking, responding, deciding, interacting, pretending. Sleep becomes the only place where none of those demands exist. Families may interpret this as laziness. You have been in bed all day. The person already knows. They may hate themselves for it, but getting out of bed does not feel like one simple movement. It feels like re-entering a world they do not currently possess enough psychological energy to manage. That is why criticism often fails. The person does not need more evidence that they are disappointing people. They need help understanding the state and support taking action small enough that the nervous system can realistically complete them. Depression can change movement. Some people become agitated. They pace, wringing their hands, shift constantly, feel unable to settle. The body appears anxious, restless, uncomfortable. Others experience psychomotor retardation. Their movement slow. Speech slows. Response time increases. Facial expressions become reduced. Walking feels heavy. Thinking feels delayed. Everything takes longer. This is not simply a lack of motivation. The entire system appears to be operating at reduced speed. Imagine your mind sending a command, but your body receives it several seconds late. Stand up, walk to the bathroom, brush your teeth, answer the message. Each action requires more effort than its size should demand. People around the person may become impatient. Why are you moving so slowly? Why does everything take so long? But the person is not necessarily choosing slowness. The depressive state has altered the speed of psychological and physical functioning. This is another reason depression cannot be reduced to sadness. Sadness does not automatically slow speech, movement, decision-making, and cognition. A major depressive episode can. One of the most common symptoms of depression is fatigue, but depression-related fatigue is not always solved by rest. That is what makes it so confusing. The person sleeps and remains exhausted. They spend the weekend doing very little, and Monday still feels impossible. They may say, I am tired all the time. Others respond, but you have not done anything. That statement misunderstands the kind of work depression creates. Internal suffering consumes energy. Constant self-monitoring consumes energy. Trying to appear normal consumes energy. Making simple decisions consumes energy. Fighting thoughts you do not want consumes energy. Pretending to enjoy conversations consumes energy. Getting through a day while your mind repeatedly tells you nothing matters consumes energy. The person may not have completed many visible tasks. That does not mean nothing was happening. They may have spent the entire day resisting collapse. This is one of the invisible burdens of depression. The world measures effort by observable output. The depressed person may be exerting enormous effort simply to remain present. When others say, you are not trying, the person may hear, even your survival effort does not count. That can deepen hopelessness. Again, understanding does not mean expectations disappear. It means expectations need to match the person's actual psychological capacity, while treatment helps rebuild it. Depression changes self-evaluation, not only how the person feels, but the standards of evidence they use to decide who they are. One mistake becomes proof of incompetence. One conflict becomes proof they ruin relationships. One missed responsibility becomes proof they are unreliable. One financial problem becomes proof they have destroyed their future. Depression takes limited evidence and produces global conclusions. I made a mistake becomes I am a mistake. I disappointed someone becomes I disappoint everyone. I am struggling right now becomes I have always been broken. Notice the movement. Specific becomes global. Temporary becomes permanent. Behavior becomes identity. That is depressive reasoning. And from inside describe the episode, it often feels intellectually honest. The person may believe they are finally seeing themselves clearly. Everyone else is accused of being overly positive. You do not understand. You were just saying that because you love me. You do not know what I am really like. Depression often dismisses compassionate evidence as biased, while treating critical evidence as objective. That is an extraordinary cognitive distortion. Compliments are rejected. Mistakes are admitted as proof. Success is explained away. Failure is personalized. If something goes well, I got lucky. If something goes poorly, that is who I am. The standards are not equal. Depression quietly changes the rules of the trial, then convinces the person the verdict is fair. Guilt may also become disproportionate. The person remembers mistakes from years ago. Conversations replay. Things they wish they had done differently become emotionally immediate again. They may feel responsible for events outside their control. A parent believes their child's difficulties prove they failed. A spouse believes the entire marriage problem is their fault. An employee believes the entire company would be better without them. The guilt feels moral, but its intensity may be generated by the depressive state. This is why clinicians listen carefully when someone begins describing themselves as a burden, because burdens can be removed. And when a depressed mind begins seeing the self as the problem, suicidal thinking can become more psychologically available. Depression affects cognition. Reading becomes difficult. The person reaches the bottom of a page and realizes nothing was retained. They watch television but cannot follow the plot. Someone gives instructions and the information disappears. They begin tasks, then lose track of what they were doing. Decision-making becomes exhausting. What should I eat? What should I wear? Should I answer this message? Should I go to work? Should I stay home? Small decisions carry enormous weight. Why? Because decision-making requires the mind to imagine outcomes, assign value, compare options, and tolerate uncertainty. Depression can impair every one of those processes. If every option feels disappointing, how do you choose? If you do not trust your judgment, how do you commit? If mistakes feel like proof of worthlessness, every decision becomes dangerous. Indecisiveness is not always a lack of preference. Sometimes it is fear that any choice will become more evidence against the self. The person may ask others to decide, then feel guilty for needing help, or they avoid deciding altogether, which creates additional consequences, which then reinforce the belief that they are incapable. This is how symptoms begin creating environments that appear to confirm them. The person cannot concentrate. Work declines. They are criticized. And depression says, see, I told you that you were failing. The symptom produces the consequence. The consequence is then misinterpreted as evidence of identity. That loop can become devastating. Now we need to speak carefully, clearly, and directly. Major depressive episodes can include recurrent thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicide planning, or suicide attempts. Not everyone with bipolar depression experiences suicidal thinking, but bipolar disorder can carry serious suicide risk, and we should never minimize it. Sometimes suicidal thoughts are active. I want to die. Sometimes they are passive. I wish I would not wake up. I do not want to kill myself, but I do not want to keep living like this. If something happened to me, I would not care. Passive thoughts still matter. They communicate that life has become psychologically difficult to continue inhabiting. One of the mistakes people make is assuming suicidal thinking always means the person wants death itself. Often, they want the suffering to stop. Death begins appearing as the only available exit. That does not make the situation less serious. It tells us hopelessness has narrowed the person's ability to imagine alternatives. The suicidal mind often becomes constricted. It stops seeing the full landscape. It sees pain, burden, failure, and permanence. The person may think, my family will be better without me. That thought often feels selfless. It is not. It is depression speaking in the language of sacrifice. The person believes removing themselves will protect others, but the conclusion is being generated by a state that has already distorted their understanding of worth, impact, and possibility. This is why direct questions about suicide do not create suicidal thoughts. They create room for honesty. Have you been thinking about death? Have you wished you would not wake up? Have you thought about killing yourself? Have you made a plan? These questions matter. Avoiding them does not protect the person. It protects everyone else from discomfort. If you are experiencing suicidal thoughts, this is not a moment to manage privately. Contact emergency services, a crisis resource, a trusted support person, or a qualified mental health professional immediately. Understanding your psychology matters. Safety comes first. Bipolar depression can look almost identical to major depressive disorder. The person presents with sadness, anhedonia, fatigue, sleep disturbance, guilt, poor concentration, and suicidal thinking. Nothing about that presentation automatically announces bipolar disorder. The distinction often exists in the history. Has the person ever experienced mania, hypomania, periods of dramatically reduced need for sleep, unusual confidence, accelerated speech, increased goal-directed activity, risk-taking that represents a clear departure from baseline? Without those questions, the depressive episode may be treated as unipolar depression. That matters because treatment decisions can differ. Antidepressants may be used in some bipolar treatment plans, but they require careful clinical consideration because in some people, they may contribute to mood destabilization, including switching into mania or hypomania. This does not mean antidepressants always cause mania. It means bipolar history matters because treatment is chosen. The diagnosis is not determined only by what the person is experiencing today. It is determined by the pattern across their life. That principle is essential. Psychiatric assessment is not a photograph. It is a film. A photograph captures the current state. A film reveals the trajectory. For some people, depression follows elevation. The contrast can be psychologically brutal. During mania or hypomania, the person may have felt brilliant, powerful, creative, attractive, purposeful, capable of anything. Then the energy disappears. Projects remain unfinished. Money is gone. Relationships are damaged. Messages were sent. Promises were made. The person returns to ordinary consciousness and finds evidence of decisions they can barely understand. That depression is not only biological, it may also be filled with consequence, shame, embarrassment, loss, confusion. The person is not merely grieving how they feel now. They may be grieving who they believe they were becoming. Imagine believing you were about to change the world, then struggling to take a shower. Imagine speaking with complete certainty, then becoming afraid to make basic decisions. Imagine feeling connected to everything, then feeling connected to nothing. That contrast can become its own source of suffering. The person may think, which version of me is real? The person with extraordinary confidence or the person who cannot get out of bed? That is not simply a mood question. It is an identity crisis. And we will explore that much more deeply in part 2. Now we need to discuss one of the most dangerous, distressing, and misunderstood presentations in bipolar disorder: mixed features. People often imagine bipolar disorder as two separate poles: mania on one side, depression on the other. Happy, then sad. High, then low. But human psychology does not always alternate so cleanly. Sometimes symptoms from both poles occur together. A person may feel deeply depressed, hopeless, worthless, and suicidal, while also experiencing increased energy, agitation, racing thoughts, irritability, or reduced need for sleep. Think about what that means. Depression can create the desire to escape life. Activation can provide the energy to act. That combination deserves serious attention. A person with mixed features may not appear slowed down. They may appear restless, angry, activated, unable to sleep. Their thoughts race, but the content is dark. Their energy increases, but their hope does not. This destroys the stereotype that suicidal risk always looks quiet, withdrawn, and exhausted. Sometimes risk looks agitated, pacing, irritable, unable to settle, saying, "I cannot take this anymore." The person may describe feeling trapped inside their own activation, too energized to rest, too depressed to use the energy constructively, too agitated to think clearly, too hopeless to imagine relief. That is a profoundly painful psychological state. Mixed features can also make diagnosis more difficult. The person may appear anxious, agitated, emotionally volatile. Clinicians may focus on one side and miss the other, but the simultaneous presence of depressive and manic symptoms changes both risk and treatment considerations. Again, the pattern matters, not one symptom. The configuration. Bipolar episodes may occur with anxious distress. This can involve feeling keyed up, restless, unable to concentrate because of worry, fearful that something terrible may happen, or afraid of losing control. Anxiety can intensify both mania and depression. During depression, anxiety may turn hopelessness into constant anticipation of disaster. The person is not only suffering now, they are repeatedly rehearsing everything that could go wrong next. During mania, anxiety may combine with acceleration. Thoughts race, but rather than feeling excited, they feel urgent and threatening. The person may become increasingly reactive, suspicious, overwhelmed, unable to settle. This is another reason mania should not be mistaken for happiness. Elevation can contain enormous distress. The system is activated, but activation is not always pleasure. Sometimes it feels like being unable to escape your own internal speed. Rapid cycling refers to experiencing at least 4 mood episodes within a 12-month period. Those episodes may include mania, hypomania, or major depression. The phrase is frequently misunderstood. People sometimes use rapid cycling to describe mood changes occurring several times in one day. But clinically, rapid cycling refers to the number of distinct episodes occurring across a year. That does not mean people cannot experience emotional shifts within a day. They can, but moment-to-moment reactivity is not automatically rapid cycling bipolar disorder. This distinction becomes especially important when differentiating bipolar disorder from trauma-related emotional reactivity, ADHD, personality disorders, substance effects, or ordinary responses to changing circumstances. Episodes have duration. They involve a recognizable change from baseline. They affect multiple psychological systems. Rapid cycling does not remove those requirements. It means the episodes occur more frequently. Imagine the burden of repeatedly rebuilding your life after each state. The person emerges from depression, begins repairing routines, returns to work, reconnects with people. Then elevation arrives, sleep decreases, plans expand, judgment changes. Then another depression follows. The individual is not only managing symptoms, they are repeatedly managing the consequences of interrupted continuity. This can make identity, employment, relationships, and treatment adherence much more difficult. Stability becomes hard to trust. Even improvement may create anxiety. How long will this last? Is this happiness, or am I becoming hypomanic? Am I tired, or is this depression returning? The person may begin monitoring every emotional shift. That vigilance can itself become exhausting. Some depressive episodes occur with melancholic features. This presentation often includes a profound loss of pleasure, a lack of emotional response even to events that would normally feel positive. Early morning awakening, depression that feels worse in the morning, significant psychomotor slowing or agitation, reduced appetite, weight loss, or excessive guilt. The phrase lack of reactivity matters. Imagine receiving good news and feeling no internal movement. Someone you love visits, and you remain emotionally flat. Something you prayed for finally happens, and it does not reach you. This can create enormous shame. The person may think, what kind of person does not feel happy to see their own family? But the emotional absence is not proof of insufficient love. The depressive system is impairing the person's capacity to experience reward and connection. The relationship may still matter deeply. The emotional signal is not arriving normally. That distinction can protect people from interpreting a symptom as a moral failure. The word atypical can be misleading. It does not mean rare. A depressive episode with atypical features may include mood reactivity, meaning the person's mood can temporarily improve in response to positive events, along with increased appetite, weight gain, excessive sleep, a heavy feeling in the limbs, a long-standing sensitivity to interpersonal rejection. Mood reactivity can confuse people. They think if you laughed yesterday, you cannot be depressed. That is false. A depressed person may laugh, attend an event, enjoy a conversation for an hour, feel temporarily lighter after receiving good news. Depression does not require uninterrupted misery every second of the day. Psychological states are not cartoons. The person may experience moments of relief, then return to the depressive baseline. People sometimes use those moments against them. You seemed fine earlier. Fine is not the same as recovered. A moment of emotional access does not erase the larger episode. Severe mood episodes may include psychotic features. Psychosis involves a significant disruption in reality testing. This may include delusions, hallucinations, or severely disorganized thinking and behavior. A delusion is a fixed false belief that remains despite strong contradictory evidence. A hallucination is a sensory experience occurring without an external stimulus. The person may hear voices, see things, feel sensations, or experience beliefs that others do not share. Psychosis can occur during mania or severe depression. And one of the most important things to understand is this: psychosis does not necessarily feel like losing touch with reality. It often feels like discovering reality. That is why saying that is not real may not immediately help. From the person's perspective, you are not correcting a misunderstanding. You may be denying something they experience as obvious truth. During mania, the person may believe they possess special powers, have been chosen for a divine mission, are receiving messages from television, or have extraordinary status or wealth. During depression, psychotic beliefs may center on guilt, ruin, illness, punishment, or worthlessness. The person may believe they have committed an unforgivable crime, that they have financially destroyed their entire family, that their body is dying despite medical reassurance, that they deserve punishment. These beliefs can be mood congruent, meaning they fit the emotional direction of the episode. Grandiose beliefs during mania. Catastrophic or guilt-based beliefs during depression. Psychotic features can also be mood incongruent, meaning the content does not clearly match the mood state. That distinction may offer clinicians additional information, but either presentation requires serious evaluation. Psychosis changes the level of concern. It changes diagnosis. It may change treatment, and it often changes safety planning. There is another crucial diagnostic distinction. When psychosis occurs only during a manic or depressive episode, it may be understood as part of bipolar disorder with psychotic features. But when psychosis clearly persists for a significant period outside of any major mood episode, the clinician must consider other possibilities, including schizoaffective disorder or another schizophrenia spectrum presentation. That does not mean one brief moment of uncertainty determines the diagnosis. It means the relationship between psychosis and mood episodes matters. When did the psychosis begin? Did it continue after the mood symptoms resolved? Has it ever occurred when the person was not manic or depressed? Again, psychiatric assessment is not simply about identifying a symptom. It is about understanding where the symptom lives inside the larger pattern. Imagine believing the television is sending you messages. Your family says that is not happening, but you continue noticing words, images, numbers, and coincidences that seem personally relevant. Now their denial becomes part of the explanation. They cannot see it. They are trying to hide it. They're involved. Contradictory evidence does not always weaken a delusion. Sometimes it is absorbed into it. This is why aggressive confrontation may increase defensiveness. The person may feel misunderstood, threatened, or persecuted. That does not mean families should affirm false beliefs. You do not have to say, yes, the television is communicating with you. A more grounded response might be, I understand that this feels completely real to you. I am not experiencing it the same way, and I am concerned about how little you have slept. That response does not validate the delusion. It validates the person's emotional experience while remaining anchored in shared reality. That distinction is important. Catatonia is a severe disturbance in movement and responsiveness that can occur with mood disorders and other psychiatric or medical conditions. A person may become unusually still, unresponsive, maintain a fixed posture, resist movement, repeat words or movements, or display purposeless agitation. Catatonia is not simply refusing to speak. It is not stubbornness. It is a serious clinical condition requiring immediate assessment. People may assume the person is choosing not to respond, but catatonia reflects profound dysregulation in systems governing movement, behavior, and responsiveness. Again, what appears behavioral may have a much deeper biological and psychological foundation. Peripartum onset. Bipolar episodes may occur during pregnancy or after childbirth. This deserves special attention because postpartum mood changes are often minimized. People say she is just tired. It's hormones. Every new mother feels overwhelmed. Some emotional fluctuation after childbirth is common, but severe depression, mania, psychosis, dramatically reduced need for sleep, agitation, confusion, grandiosity, or unusual beliefs require immediate evaluation. Postpartum psychosis is a psychiatric emergency. The person may experience rapidly changing moods, severe insomnia, confusion, delusions, hallucinations, or beliefs involving the baby. This is not a failure of motherhood. It is not evidence that the person does not love their child. It is a severe mental health condition requiring urgent care. The shame surrounding these experiences often prevents families from speaking openly, but silence does not protect the parent or child. Recognition does. Seasonal pattern. Some people experience mood episodes in a seasonal pattern. Depressive episodes may repeatedly emerge during particular times of the year. In some individuals, elevated episodes may also show seasonal regularity. The important word is pattern. One difficult winter does not establish a seasonal pattern. Clinicians look for repeated relationships between the time of year and the onset or remission of episodes. Seasonal changes may affect light exposure, sleep timing, daily structure, and biological rhythms. Again, the brain does not operate independently from environment. The calendar itself does not cause bipolar disorder, but environmental rhythms can influence vulnerable mood regulation systems. Severity and remission status. Another part of accurate diagnosis involves describing the current severity of the episode and whether the person is in partial or full remission. Severity is not determined by how dramatic the episode looks to strangers. It is informed by symptom intensity, the number of symptoms present, the degree of impairment, the level of distress, the presence of psychosis, safety concerns, and how much functioning has changed. An episode may be described as mild, moderate, or severe, but those words should never be used casually. Mild does not mean meaningless. Moderate does not mean manageable without help. Severe does not mean hopeless. These terms describe the current clinical burden, not the person's value, not their effort, not their future. Remission describes what happens as symptoms improve. Partial remission may mean some symptoms remain or that the full criteria are no longer met, but not enough time has passed to consider the episode fully resolved. Full remission means the significant signs of symptoms of the recent episode are no longer present for a sustained period. But even full remission does not always mean life instantly returns to normal. The episode may have ended while the person is still rebuilding sleep, confidence, finances, work performance, relationships, and trust in their own judgment. This is why remission and recovery are related, but not identical. Remission describes the reduction or absence of the episode's symptoms. Recovery may involve repairing what the episode disrupted. That can take much longer. People sometimes imagine bipolar disorder as dramatic episodes, separated by perfect normality. For some people, there are long periods of strong functioning between episodes. They work, create, maintain relationships, parent, travel, lead, build meaningful lives. Bipolar disorder does not erase a person's capacity, but for others, the space between episodes may still contain vulnerability. Sleep remains fragile. Concentration feels less reliable. Energy does not immediately return. Residual depressive symptoms linger. Anxiety about recurrence grows. The person may become afraid of feeling too good. That is a painful consequence people rarely discuss. Imagine finally feeling hopeful, then becoming afraid of your own hope. You wake with energy and immediately ask, is this healthy or is an episode beginning? You feel creative and wonder, can I trust this? You sleep 1 hour less than usual and begin monitoring every thought. You make an exciting plan, then become afraid that the excitement itself is dangerous. The person can become hypervigilant toward their own internal life. That vigilance is understandable, but it can also make stability feel restrictive. The goal of recovery is not to become emotionally flat. It is not to fear every strong feeling. It is not to live in constant suspicion of yourself. The goal is to develop enough awareness, structure, support, and self-knowledge to distinguish normal emotional range from the early development of an episode. That distinction is rarely learned overnight. It often develops through experience, tracking patterns, understanding baseline, recognizing changes in sleep, listening to trusted feedback, knowing what early warning signs have looked like before, and learning that self-awareness is not the same thing as self-surveillance. One helps you understand yourself. The other can make you afraid to be yourself. That difference will matter deeply in part 2. Differential diagnosis. Now we arrive at one of the most important sections in this entire masterclass, because recognizing symptoms is only the beginning. Many psychological medical conditions can resemble parts of bipolar disorder. Accurate diagnosis requires determining which explanation best accounts for the full pattern. This is called differential diagnosis. And it matters because the wrong diagnosis can produce the wrong treatment, the wrong expectations, and the wrong story about who the person is. Let's begin with one of the most commonly confused conditions: bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. Bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder can both involve emotional intensity, impulsivity, relationship difficulty, anger, self-harm, and changes in mood, but they are not the same condition. Bipolar disorder is organized around mood episodes that typically last days, weeks, or longer, and involve changes in energy, sleep, thinking, activity, and functioning. Borderline personality disorder is more centrally organized around pervasive patterns involving identity, relationships, fear of abandonment, emotional regulation, and sensitivity to relational disruption. A person with borderline personality disorder may experience intense emotional shifts within minutes or hours, often in response to interpersonal events, a perceived rejection, a delayed text, a change in someone's tone, a fear that someone is leaving. Bipolar episodes do not usually require an immediate relational trigger. The mood state may persist across different environments, relationships, and circumstances. This does not mean the two conditions cannot occur together. They can. It means clinicians must not diagnose based on emotional intensity alone. Ask, how long do the changes last? What triggers them? Does sleep change? Does energy change? Is there grandiosity? Is there decreased need for sleep? Does the pattern continue even when the relationship situation changes? What happens between episodes? The answers matter. Bipolar disorder and ADHD. ADHD and bipolar disorder can both involve distractibility, talkativeness, impulsivity, restlessness, difficulty completing tasks, and rapid thinking. Again, the pattern distinguishes them. ADHD is generally chronic. The traits begin in childhood and appear across settings. The person has suddenly departed from baseline. This is their long-standing baseline. Bipolar symptoms are episodic. There is a noticeable change from how the person ordinarily functions. Someone with ADHD may always be distractible. During mania, a person may become dramatically more distractible than usual. Someone with ADHD may stay up late and feel exhausted the next day. During mania, the person may sleep 2 hours and feel fully energized. Someone with ADHD may speak quickly because of excitement or impulsivity. During mania, speech may become pressured and increasingly difficult to interrupt. Again, one symptom cannot decide the diagnosis, duration, onset, baseline, sleep, energy, severity, and episodicity all matter. ADHD and bipolar disorder can also coexist. That makes assessment even more complex. The clinician must determine which symptoms are chronic, which are episodic, and how the conditions interact. Bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. The depressive episodes can look the same. The difference is the history of mania or hypomania. A person with major depressive disorder has not experienced manic or hypomanic episodes. A person with bipolar 1 has experienced mania. A person with bipolar 2 has experienced hypomania and major depression without a history of mania. This is why asking only about depression is insufficient. The clinician must investigate the entire mood history. Sometimes family members provide the missing information. The person says, I have only ever been depressed. The spouse says, what about the week you slept 2 hours a night, spent $15,000 and tried to launch 3 companies? The person may not have interpreted that period as illness. They may have remembered it as productivity. Collateral information can reveal episodes the person never thought to report. Bipolar disorder and trauma. Trauma can affect sleep, mood, concentration, irritability, impulsivity, relationships, and nervous system activation. A traumatized person may become hypervigilant, sleep less because they feel unsafe, react intensely to reminders, experience emotional numbing, become agitated, or feel disconnected from reality. These experiences can superficially resemble aspects of bipolar disorder, but trauma symptoms are often organized around threat, memory, triggers, avoidance, and nervous system responses to perceived danger. Bipolar episodes involve broader shifts in mood and energy that may occur without trauma reminders. Again, the conditions can coexist. Having trauma does not rule out bipolar disorder. Having bipolar disorder does not mean every emotional response is an episode. Good assessments avoid forcing one explanation to account for everything. Substance or medication-induced symptoms, stimulants, cocaine, methamphetamine, certain medications, steroids, and other substances can produce elevated mood, reduced sleep, grandiosity, agitation, or psychosis. Alcohol and other substances may also worsen mood instability. Clinicians must examine timing. Did the symptoms begin during intoxication, withdrawal, after starting a medication, after increasing a dose? Do they continue after the substance effect should have resolved? Was there a previous history of episodes without substance involvement? These questions protect against diagnosing a primary bipolar disorder when the symptoms are better explained by another cause. They also protect against blaming substances for a long-standing mood pattern that existed independently. Again, accuracy requires humility. Medical conditions, thyroid disorders, neurological conditions, sleep disorders, hormonal changes, and other medical issues can affect mood and energy. A comprehensive evaluation may include medical history, physical examination, laboratory testing, and review of medications. Mental health does not mean not physical. Every psychological experience is occurring through a body. Responsible care examines both. Bipolar disorder and schizophrenia spectrum conditions. Bipolar disorder with psychotic features can sometimes be confused with schizoaffective disorder. Schizophrenia or another psychotic disorder. The central question is not simply, has psychosis occurred? The question is, how is the psychosis related to the mood episode? In bipolar disorder with psychotic features, the psychosis occurs during severe mood episodes. The person is manic or severely depressed, and psychosis develops within that state. When the mood episode resolves, the psychosis also resolves. In schizoaffective disorder, There must be a period of psychosis occurring outside the major mood episode. That distinction is clinically significant. It requires careful longitudinal history, not a quick judgment based on one emergency room presentation. Because if someone arrives highly agitated, grandiose, or psychotic, the clinician still needs to understand what happened before, what happens after, and whether psychosis has ever existed independently of major mood symptoms. Again, the film matters more than the photograph. Diagnosis is often treated like a label, a word attached to a person, but that is not its best purpose. A diagnosis should organize information. It should help explain the pattern, guide the treatment, clarify the risk, improve communication, and help the person make sense of experiences that may have felt chaotic. A diagnosis should never become the person's entire identity. You are not bipolar. You are a human being who may live with bipolar disorder. That distinction is not cosmetic. Language shapes identity. When a diagnosis becomes a noun, it can swallow the person. Everything they feel becomes bipolar. Every disagreement becomes bipolar. Every passionate idea becomes bipolar. Every difficult day becomes bipolar. That is not accurate. People with bipolar disorder still have personalities, values, preferences, trauma histories, relationship patterns, ordinary emotions, good days, bad days, and reactions that have nothing to do with an episode. The diagnosis explains a pattern. It does not explain the entire human being. At this point, we understand the bipolar spectrum, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2, cyclothymic disorder, mania, hypomania, major depression, mixed features, psychosis, specifiers, differential diagnosis. We understand that bipolar disorder is not ordinary moodiness. It is not a personality flaw. It is not simply happiness followed by sadness. It involves episodes capable of changing mood, energy, sleep, judgment, activity, behavior, and sometimes reality testing. But knowing the diagnostic structure creates another set of questions. Questions the DSM cannot answer by itself. Why does mania feel so true while it is happening? Why does confidence become almost impossible to challenge? Why do loved ones often recognize the episode before the person experiencing it? Why can stability feel like loss? Why do some people miss the version of themselves they became during hypomania? Why does depression sound like truth instead of illness? Why can psychosis feel like revelation? Why might someone stop medication even after treatment helped? Why does shame become so powerful after the episode ends? Why can recovery create an identity crisis? And how do people rebuild trust, relationships, self-respect, and stewardship after episodes that change the direction of their lives? Those are not merely diagnostic questions. They are psychological questions. And that is where we are going next in part 2. We are going beneath the symptoms into identity, meaning, insight, certainty, shame, relationships, medication, accountability, recovery, and the difficult work of learning to govern a life when your internal state can sometimes change the person doing the governing. Because understanding bipolar disorder is not complete when you can recognize an episode. The deeper understanding begins when you can explain why the episode felt like reality, why stability may not automatically feel like freedom, and what it takes to build a life that protects both the person you are today and the person you will still have to be when the state changes. And that is where part 2 begins.